The porch light wasn't on. That was the first wrong thing Daniel Ashworth noticed, pulling into the circular driveway of the house he grew up in, 3 days before his father's funeral. The second wrong thing was the shape huddled against the stone pillar by the front steps, wrapped in what looked like a car blanket, small enough in the darkness that for one disorienting second he mistook her for a stranger. Then she lifted her head, and Daniel realized he was looking at his mother, sitting on the cold concrete of her own front porch at 11 o'clock at night, locked out of a house with 14 rooms. "Mom!" His voice cracked on the single syllable. He was out of the car before he'd even turned off the engine. Keys still in the ignition, door hanging open behind him. "Mom, what happened? Why are you out here?" Eleanor Ashworth looked up at her son with an expression he'd never seen on her face in 34 years of knowing it. Not grief, though her husband had died 4 days earlier, not confusion, though she was 71 and the night was cold enough to see her breath. It was something closer to quiet, exhausted resignation. The specific look of a person who has stopped expecting anyone to ask the question Daniel had just asked. "Your brother changed the locks," she said simply, and pulled the blanket tighter around her thin shoulders. "I didn't want to make a scene before the funeral." Daniel had flown 11 hours from Singapore expecting to bury his father. He had no idea he was about to discover that the real funeral, the one for the family he thought he still had, was only just beginning. Daniel Ashworth had left home at 22, the way ambitious sons from difficult houses often do, telling himself it was for the job and not entirely believing it. He'd taken a position with the logistics firm's regional office in Hong Kong, then Singapore, building a career in supply chain management that kept him comfortably, conveniently far from the particular gravity of the Ashworth family estate outside Portland, Maine. 12 years had passed since he'd lived under that roof full-time. Visits had grown shorter and further apart, first because of distance and cost, then because of something harder to name, a low, persistent friction that made every homecoming feel like walking back into a room where an argument had paused rather than ended. His father, Walter Ashworth, had built a modestly successful chain of hardware and building supply stores across northern New England, the kind of quiet, unglamorous wealth that let a family live comfortably without ever appearing in any regional business magazine. Walter had been a hard man in the specific old-fashioned way that many men of his generation were hard, unsentimental with affection, generous with criticism, the kind of father who showed love through providing rather than through saying anything at all. Daniel had spent much of his 20s trying to earn a warmth from his father that never quite arrived, and had eventually, exhaustedly, stopped trying. His older brother, Marcus, had taken the opposite path. Where Daniel left, Marcus stayed, working his way up through the family business, marrying a woman named Priscilla whose family had considerably more money and considerably more comfort with using it as leverage than the Ashworths ever had, and gradually, over the better part of a decade, becoming the son who managed things. Walter's health, Walter's finances, Walter's house. Daniel had no idea, boarding his flight in Singapore after the brief, devastating call informing him his father had died of a sudden cardiac event, exactly how completely managing things had come to mean something considerably darker than he understood. He arrived at the Portland airport a little past 9 in the evening, rented a car because he hadn't told anyone the exact time of his flight, and drove the familiar 40 minutes north toward the house on Cobbett's Pond Road, rehearsing in his mind the conversation he expected to have with his mother, a quiet, grief-softened evening of sitting together, going through old photographs, preparing for the difficult days ahead. He had absolutely no idea he was about to find her outside in the cold instead. "Marcus changed the locks," Eleanor repeated, when Daniel knelt beside her on the porch, his hands automatically checking her arms, her face, for any sign she'd been physically hurt rather than simply, cruelly excluded. "Priscilla said it was for security. Since your father passed, they said the house needed to be protected. New system, new codes, new locks. Nobody thought to give me a key." "Nobody thought," Daniel repeated, hearing the flatness in his own voice. "Mom, how long have you been out here?" Eleanor considered the question with the same careful, unhurried precision she brought to most things, a habit Daniel remembered from childhood, his mother weighing every word before she offered it, as though speech were a limited resource to be spent wisely. "Since about 6, she finally said. "I went to visit Doris down the road for supper. When I came back I couldn't get in. I called the house phone. Nobody answered. I called Marcus's cell 3 times. He didn't pick up. 3 hours, Daniel said. You've been sitting out here for almost 5 hours in November, Mom. I had the blanket from the car, Eleanor said, as though this fact should be reassuring rather than devastating. I didn't want to bother the neighbors. It's a hard week for everybody. That single sentence, delivered without a trace of self-pity, nearly broke something in Daniel's chest. His mother, locked out of her own home 4 days after burying her husband of 46 years, had spent the evening worrying about being a bother to the neighbors rather than being angry about the family that had left her in the cold. He had no idea, helping her to her feet with hands that were shaking now, more from anger than the temperature, that this single locked door was only the smallest, most visible thread of something Marcus and Priscilla had been quietly, methodically weaving together for considerably longer than the 4 days since Walter's death. Daniel got his mother into his rental car, cranked the heat as high as it would go, and drove directly to the small bed and breakfast in town where he'd originally planned to stay before assuming wrongly that he'd simply be welcomed back into his childhood bedroom. Eleanor's hands trembled around the paper cup of tea the innkeeper brought her, not entirely from cold anymore, Daniel suspected, but from the particular, delayed shock of finally being warm enough to feel everything she'd been holding at bay on that porch. Mom, Daniel said, once she'd stopped shivering, once some color had returned to her face. I need you to tell me what's actually been happening. Not the polite version. What's really going on with Marcus and Priscilla? Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup and was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an exhaustion that went considerably deeper than one cold evening on a porch. Your father's illness lasted longer than anyone told you, she said. 2 years, Daniel. Not 4 days. He had a series of small strokes starting almost 2 years ago. Nothing dramatic enough to put in an obituary. Little things. Confusion sometimes. Trouble with numbers, with names. Marcus told me not to worry you with it. Said you had your career overseas. Said there was nothing you could do from that distance anyway. Said it would only distract you. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the November air. 2 years, he repeated. You're telling me Dad was declining for 2 years and nobody told me. I wanted to, Eleanor said quietly. I called you twice, actually meaning to tell you. Both times I lost my nerve, or Marcus called first and smoothed it over before I got the chance. He's very good at smoothing things over, your brother. Always has been. And during those 2 years, who was managing things? The business, the house, Dad's care. Marcus, Eleanor said. And increasingly, Priscilla. Your father signed over power of attorney to Marcus about 14 months ago, when the confusion was getting worse. Seemed sensible at the time. Somebody needed to be able to make decisions when your father couldn't. Daniel had no idea, sitting in that small warmly lit bed and breakfast parlor listening to his mother's careful measured account, that the phrase power of attorney was about to become the exact hinge on which the rest of this story would turn. Mom, Daniel said slowly, choosing his words with care. What exactly has Marcus been doing with that power for the past 14 months? Eleanor set down her tea. I don't fully know, she admitted. That's the truth of it, Daniel. I don't fully know because nobody has explained anything to me clearly. I know the house was refinanced about 8 months ago. I know 2 of the hardware store locations were sold last spring, though your father never mentioned wanting to sell anything. I know that when I asked Marcus directly what was happening with our finances, he told me not to trouble myself, that everything was being handled properly, that I should focus on taking care of your father. And you believed him. I trusted him, Eleanor corrected gently. There's a difference, and I'm only now understanding how large a difference it is. The following morning, Daniel drove to the family house alone, while his mother rested at the inn, and found Marcus already there, along with a locksmith's van still parked in the driveway from what Daniel assumed was yesterday's installation. Marcus opened the door before Daniel had a chance to knock, his expression carrying the particular, practiced smoothness of a man who had already decided exactly how this conversation was going to go. Danny, Marcus said, using the childhood nickname with a warmth that struck Daniel in that moment as almost grotesquely inappropriate. Good you're here. We need to talk logistics for the service. We need to talk about why our mother spent 5 hours locked outside this house last night, Daniel said, not moving from the doorway. Marcus's expression flickered, just briefly, before resettling into something careful and apologetic. God, Danny, I feel terrible about that. Priscilla and I had the security system updated after Dad passed, given everything going on with the estate, and there was a miscommunication about giving Mom the new code. It should never have happened. I already apologized to her. You didn't answer your phone. She called you 3 times. I was at the funeral home finalizing arrangements, Marcus said smoothly. Signal's terrible in that basement. I didn't see the missed calls until this morning. Daniel studied his brother's face, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Some flicker of the childhood Marcus he remembered, before career and Priscilla's family money and whatever had happened over the past 14 months had reshaped him into this careful, controlled stranger. He had no idea, standing on that doorstep, exactly how much evidence was sitting inside a locked filing cabinet 3 rooms away that would eventually prove every word of Marcus's smooth explanation false. I want to see Dad's financial records, Daniel said. All of them. The power of attorney documents, the house refinancing, the store sales. Everything. Something tightened almost imperceptibly around Marcus's eyes. That's not really necessary, Danny. Everything's been handled properly. I understand you're grieving, we all are. But questioning the finances right now feels like a strange place to put your energy. It's exactly where I want to put my energy, Daniel said. Because our mother slept outside last night in a blanket from her own car. And I want to understand exactly how a family that owns this house ended up in a situation where that was even possible. Marcus's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, the smooth, practiced warmth dropped away entirely, revealing something considerably colder underneath. You've been gone 12 years, Daniel. You don't get to fly in 3 days before the funeral and start making demands about a business and a family you walked away from. I didn't walk away from Mom, Daniel said quietly. I walked away from Dad, and honestly maybe from you too if I'm being fully honest about it. But I never walked away from her. And right now I'm looking at a version of you I don't recognize, and I want to understand what happened. Marcus said nothing for a long moment, then stepped back from the doorway, gesturing Daniel inside with the particular, tight courtesy of someone conceding a battle he had no intention of losing the larger war over. Fine, he said. Come in. But Daniel, I want to be clear. Whatever you think you're about to find, everything I did to protect this family. You weren't here. You don't understand what the last 2 years have actually been like. Daniel had no idea, following his brother into the house he grew up in, exactly how much weight that particular defense, I did it to protect this family, was about to carry, or how thoroughly it would eventually be revealed as the exact opposite of the truth. The financial records, when Marcus finally, reluctantly produced them from a locked cabinet in what had once been Walter's home office, told a story considerably more troubling than a simple miscommunication about a locked door. Daniel spent the following 3 days, largely ignoring the mounting logistics of the funeral itself, sitting at his father's old desk with a growing stack of documents, his understanding of what had actually happened in the family's finances over the past 14 months darkening with every page. The house had indeed been refinanced 8 months earlier, pulling out nearly $400,000 in equity, ostensibly to cover his father's mounting medical expenses. But the medical records Daniel eventually requested from his father's doctors, with his mother's reluctant permission, showed total out-of-pocket costs for Walter's care over that period totaling barely $60,000, the remainder covered by the family's existing insurance. Daniel had no idea, staring at those 2 irreconcilable numbers, exactly where the remaining $340,000 had actually gone. The sale of the 2 hardware store locations told a similarly uncomfortable story. Marcus had sold both properties to a limited liability corporation called Kestrel Holdings, at a price Daniel's cursory research suggested was roughly 70% of fair market value. When he dug slightly deeper, using skills honed over a decade of reviewing supply chain contracts for irregularities, Daniel discovered that Kestrel Holdings had been registered only 16 months earlier. Its listed registered agent and attorney whose firm, according to public records, also handled legal work for Priscilla's family. He had no idea, sitting alone in his father's office late on the second night, that this single thread, an undervalued sale to a company connected to his sister-in-law's family, was about to unravel into something considerably larger than a single suspicious transaction. Daniel called an old college friend, a forensic accountant named B. Halloran who'd built a career specifically in uncovering exactly this kind of quiet, methodical family financial exploitation, and asked her somewhat desperately whether she'd be willing to review what he'd found. "Send me everything you have," B told him over the phone, her voice carrying the calm, unhurried authority of someone who had clearly had this exact conversation with other desperate, grieving family members many times before. "But Daniel, based on what you're describing, I want to prepare you. This pattern, the power of attorney obtained during a period of documented cognitive decline, the refinancing that doesn't match documented expenses, the below-market sale to a connected party, this is a fairly recognizable shape. It's called financial elder abuse, and it happens inside families considerably more often than most people realize." Daniel had no idea, hanging up that phone call, exactly how completely that clinical, unfamiliar phrase was about to reshape his understanding of the past 2 years of his family's life. He confronted Eleanor gently the following morning, choosing his words with considerably more care than he'd used with Marcus, understanding instinctively that whatever she'd absorbed and accepted over the past 14 months had likely cost her something she wasn't yet ready to fully name. "Mom," he said, sitting across from her at the small breakfast table in the inn's dining room, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable." Eleanor set down her coffee cup, something wary entering her expression. "All right. Did you ever sign anything you didn't fully understand? Over the past year or so, documents Marcus or Priscilla brought to you said were routine, said needed your signature." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the window, toward the gray November morning outside. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a specific quiet shame that made Daniel's chest ache. "Several times," she admitted. "There was so much happening with your father's care, Daniel. So many forms, so many decisions. Marcus would bring papers to the kitchen table and say, 'This is just for the insurance,' or 'This is just updating the house title for the refinancing,' and I trusted him. I didn't read every line. I should have. I know that now. But I trusted my son." "This isn't your fault," Daniel said immediately, firmly, watching the shame in her expression deepen rather than lift. "Mom, this is exactly the kind of thing that people who exploit elderly family members count on. They count on trust. They count on grief making people not want to scrutinize every document. This isn't a failure on your part. This is a pattern Marcus and Priscilla built very deliberately." "You sound very certain," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm becoming more certain every hour," Daniel admitted. "Mom, I think Marcus has been quietly draining this family's assets for over a year, using Dad's declining health as cover, and I think last night locking you out of your own house wasn't a miscommunication at all. I think it was the moment he decided you'd become inconvenient to whatever he's planning next." Eleanor's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "What are you going to do?" Daniel had no idea, sitting across from his mother in that small dining room, exactly how much the following 4 days would end up costing him in terms of the relationship with his brother, or how completely necessary that cost would ultimately prove to be. "I'm going to find out exactly what happened," Daniel said. "All of it. And then I'm going to make sure you're protected, Mom, whatever that takes." B. Halloran flew up from Boston 2 days later, arriving the morning before Walter's funeral was scheduled, carrying with her a laptop, a portable scanner, and the particular, focused calm of someone who had done this exact grim, methodical work many times before. She spent 6 hours in Walter's old office, working through the documents Daniel had gathered, cross-referencing bank statements, property records, and the LLC filings connected to Kestrel Holdings, occasionally making a small, quiet sound of confirmation that told Daniel each time that whatever suspicion had prompted it was about to become considerably more concrete. "I want to walk you through what I'm seeing," B told him that evening, once Eleanor had gone to bed, spreading a series of printed spreadsheets across the kitchen table. "First, the power of attorney itself. It was executed 14 months ago, and I pulled the notarization records. The notary who witnessed your father's signature was an employee at a bank branch where Priscilla's father sits on the board. That's not necessarily damning on its own, but it's worth noting." "What about the refinancing?" Daniel asked. "That's where it gets considerably more troubling," B said, sliding a spreadsheet toward him. "For $100,000 pulled from the home equity, structured as a single lump sum disbursement into an account that, At the time, only Marcus had signing authority over, not your father, not your mother. From that account, over the following 6 months, I'm tracing transfers totaling roughly $210,000 into accounts that eventually connect back to Priscilla's personal investment portfolio, and another $90,000 into what appears to be a down payment on a lake house in New Hampshire, purchased by Marcus and Priscilla jointly 4 months ago. Daniel felt something go very still and very cold in his chest. A lake house, purchased with money that traces directly back to your parents' home equity. Be confirmed. And Daniel, the store sales follow almost exactly the same shape. Kestrel Holdings, the company that purchased both hardware store locations well under market value, is 51% owned by a trust connected to Priscilla's family, and 49% owned, as of a filing amendment made 3 weeks ago, by Marcus directly. He sold his own father's stores to a company he partially owns, Daniel said slowly, at a price below what they were actually worth, using power of attorney my father signed while his cognition was declining. That's exactly what the documents show, be confirmed. I want to be careful here because proving intent, proving this was deliberate rather than simply poor judgment during a stressful period, that's a legal question, not just an accounting one. But Daniel, the pattern is about as clear as these patterns ever get. This isn't ambiguous mismanagement. This is systematic. Daniel had no idea, sitting at that kitchen table with the full damning shape of his brother's actions finally laid out in front of him, exactly how the following morning's funeral was about to become the setting for a confrontation he'd spent the past 4 days quietly, carefully preparing for. Walter Ashworth's funeral took place at 11 o'clock on a cold, bright Thursday morning, at the small stone church his family had attended for 3 generations, followed by a reception at the house on Cobbett's Pond Road that Marcus and Priscilla had spent considerable effort staging as a gracious, dignified gathering for the extended family and the local business community Walter had spent 40 years serving. Daniel arrived early with his mother, having spent the previous evening making a series of careful, deliberate phone calls, first to B, confirming she'd prepared a formal written summary of her findings, then to an elder law attorney B had recommended, a sharp, unhurried woman named Constance Vellum who'd agreed to attend the reception as a family friend, carrying with her a folder that contained considerably more than condolences. The service itself passed with the quiet, formal solemnity such services usually carry, Marcus delivering a eulogy that painted Walter as a devoted family man and careful steward of the family's legacy, language that struck Daniel, sitting in the front pew beside his mother, as almost unbearably ironic given what he now understood about the past 14 months. Eleanor sat through the eulogy with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face composed in the particular, practiced stillness of a woman who had spent 46 years learning how to hold difficult feelings quietly. The reception, held in the house's large formal living room, filled gradually with neighbors, former employees of the hardware store chain, extended family, and the particular assortment of local business associates that accumulate around a man who spent 4 decades as a visible, respected fixture of a small community. Daniel moved through the gathering with careful patience, waiting for the specific moment B and Constance had helped him plan, understanding instinctively that whatever confrontation was coming needed to happen with enough witnesses present that Marcus couldn't simply smooth it over with the same practiced ease he'd used on the porch 3 nights earlier. That moment arrived a little past 2 in the afternoon, when Marcus, standing near the fireplace with a small cluster of his father's former business associates, raised a glass and began, with visible pride, describing his plans for expanding the remaining hardware store locations under new, more modern management, plans he characterized as honoring his father's legacy while positioning the family business for a stronger future. "Before you continue," Daniel said, stepping into the small gathered crowd with Constance Vellum a step behind him, her folder visible in her hand, "I think there's something the room should understand about exactly how that expansion is being funded." Marcus's expression flickered, the same brief, controlled crack Daniel had seen on the porch, before resettling into careful composure. "Daniel, this isn't really the time." "I think it's exactly the time," Daniel said, keeping his voice level, deliberately calm rather than accusatory, understanding that shouting would only let Marcus reframe this as grief-fueled hysteria rather than what it actually was. "Because 4 days ago, I found our mother sitting outside this house at 11 o'clock at night, locked out of her own home in freezing weather, and when I started asking questions about why, I found something considerably larger than a miscommunication about door codes." The small crowd around the fireplace had gone quiet, several guests exchanging uncertain glances, sensing something shifting beneath the surface of what had, until that moment, been an ordinary if somber gathering. "Daniel," Marcus said, his voice tightening, "I understand you're grieving and I understand you're looking for somewhere to put that, but making accusations at Dad's reception in front of his friends is not the way to." $210,000, Daniel interrupted, still calm, still level. "That's the amount pulled from our parents' home equity refinancing that traced directly into Priscilla's personal investment accounts over the past 6 months. 90,000 more went toward the down payment on a lake house in New Hampshire that you and Priscilla purchased 4 months ago. And the 2 hardware store locations you sold last spring, the ones you just described expanding, went to a company called Kestrel Holdings, which you partially own at a price of forensic review places at roughly 70% of fair market value." The room had gone very still. Priscilla, standing near the window, went visibly pale, her hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass. "This is absurd," Marcus said, but something in his voice had lost the smooth, unshakable confidence it carried a moment earlier. "You're throwing around numbers you don't understand, from documents you had no right to review, trying to make a difficult financial period sound like some kind of scheme 3 hours after we buried our father." "I have every right to review them," Daniel said. "I'm listed as a secondary beneficiary on the estate, and I'm not the one who found these numbers, Marcus. A licensed forensic accountant did, working from documents you yourself provided when I asked to see them. If you're confident there's an innocent explanation, I'd genuinely like to hear it right now in front of everyone here." Marcus said nothing. The silence stretched, considerably longer and considerably heavier than any silence in that room had been all afternoon. Constance Vellum stepped forward then, her voice carrying the calm, unhurried authority of a woman who had delivered difficult news in far more hostile rooms than this one. "Mr. Ashworth," she said to Marcus, "my name is Constance Vellum. I'm an elder law attorney retained on behalf of your mother, Eleanor Ashworth, to review the circumstances surrounding the power of attorney executed by your father 14 months ago, and the financial transactions conducted under its authority since that time. I want to be clear that this is not, at this moment, a criminal proceeding. It is the beginning of a civil review, and I would strongly encourage you to retain your own counsel." "You can't just," Marcus started, his voice rising for the first time, the careful composure finally fully cracking. "I can and I have," Constance said evenly. "A formal request for accounting has already been filed with the probate court overseeing your father's estate. Given the documented pattern of transactions, and given the timeline showing your father's cognitive decline predating the power of attorney's execution by several months, this office will also be requesting an independent medical review of his capacity at the time that document was signed." Priscilla set down her wine glass with a sharp, unsteady clink against the mantel. "Marcus," she said quietly, urgently, "we need to leave. Now." Marcus looked around the room at the gathered guests who had, only minutes earlier, been listening to him describe honoring his father's legacy, now watching him with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning, uncomfortable understanding. He looked, finally, at his mother, standing quietly near the doorway with Daniel beside her, her expression carrying no triumph, no vindication, only a tired, sorrowful steadiness that seemed to affect him more than anything Daniel or Constance had said. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice suddenly considerably younger, considerably less certain. "You have to understand everything I did, the money, the house. I was trying to protect us. Dad's care was going to bankrupt us eventually. I was trying to get ahead of it, trying to make sure there was something left." Eleanor looked at her older son for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the anger Daniel had half expected, only a quiet, devastating clarity. "You bought a lake house, Marcus," she said, "with money you told me was for your father's medical care. And 4 nights ago, you left me sitting outside in the cold rather than answer your phone. I don't know what story you've told yourself about protecting this family, but I was part of this family too, and you left me on the porch." Marcus had no answer for that. He stood silently by the fireplace, the confident, careful man who delivered a eulogy about legacy and stewardship only 2 hours earlier, now visibly, completely unmoored, watching the room's understanding of him shift in real time. The weeks that followed unfolded with the particular, grinding slowness of legal processes that move considerably slower than the emotions driving them. The probate court granted Constance Vellum's request for a formal accounting, and the independent medical review, drawing on Walter's actual treatment records from the 2 years preceding his death, confirmed what Eleanor's account had already suggested: documented cognitive decline consistent with a series of small strokes beginning well before the power of attorney was executed, decline that a competent, honest attorney reviewing the document at the time should reasonably have flagged as a concern. Marcus retained his own counsel, as Constance had advised, and through several increasingly tense mediated sessions over the following 4 months, agreed to a settlement rather than risk a fuller, more public civil proceeding. The lake house in New Hampshire was sold. Its proceeds returned to the estate. The 2 hardware store locations sold to Kestrel Holdings were subject to an independent revaluation, and Marcus was required to pay the difference between the original sale price and fair market value back into his mother's estate. A sum that, combined with the returned investment funds, restored roughly $340,000 to Eleanor's control. Priscilla, whose family's attorney had facilitated several of the more questionable transactions, quietly separated from Marcus roughly 5 months after the funeral, a development Daniel learned about only secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance, and which he found himself absorbing with less satisfaction than he might have expected. There was very little triumph in any of it, he discovered. Mostly there was just a tired, sorrowful relief that his mother was finally fully protected, layered over a grief for the brother he'd once known that felt, in its own way, almost as heavy as the grief for his father. Eleanor moved out of the Cobbetts Pond Roadhouse within 2 months, a decision she made entirely on her own, telling Daniel simply that the house had become a place holding too many complicated memories layered over too short a time. She purchased a smaller, single-story home closer to town, close enough to walk to the library and the small cafe where she'd met her friend Doris every week for 30 years, a house with no locks anyone but Eleanor herself controlled the codes to. Daniel extended his stay in Portland considerably longer than the 10 days he'd originally planned, eventually arranging with his firm to work remotely for several months, unwilling to return to Singapore while his mother was still navigating the disorienting process of rebuilding trust in a family that had so thoroughly, quietly failed her. He helped her move, helped her set up the new house exactly the way she wanted it, and slowly over those months rebuilt a closeness with her that had somehow survived, mostly intact, the 12 years of distance and the 4 days of devastating discovery that preceded it. "I keep thinking about that night on the porch," Eleanor told him one evening, roughly 6 months after the funeral, the 2 of them sitting in her new, small living room with cups of tea going cold on the side table between them. "How strange it is that the worst moment of that entire year turned out to be the thing that actually saved me. If I hadn't found you out there," Daniel said quietly, "I don't know if I would have started asking questions in time to catch any of it." "I know," Eleanor said. "I've thought about that too. Sometimes the worst nights end up being doors, Daniel. Not endings. Just doors we didn't know we needed opened." Daniel thought often in the months that followed about the specific, quiet cruelty of that image. His mother sitting alone in the cold outside a house she'd lived in for over 3 decades, wrapped in a blanket meant for a car trunk, choosing not to make a scene rather than demanding the basic dignity of shelter. He understood slowly that the locked door itself had never really been the crime. The crime had been everything it revealed once he finally fully looked, a pattern of quiet exploitation that had been unfolding for over a year, hidden behind careful smiles and reasonable-sounding explanations, waiting for someone to finally stop accepting the smooth version of events and start asking harder questions instead. He returned to Singapore eventually, 9 months after the funeral, but not before establishing a routine of weekly video calls with his mother that neither distance nor time zones ever again interrupted, and not before making certain, through Constance Vellum's continued oversight, that every financial protection possible had been permanently built around Eleanor's remaining assets and her home. The last time Daniel visited before returning overseas, he sat with his mother on the small porch of her new house, considerably smaller than the grand columned entrance of the Cobbetts Pond Road home, but warmly lit, the porch light glowing steadily against the early evening dark. "You always leave the light on now," Daniel observed. Eleanor smiled, a small quiet smile that carried, Daniel thought, considerably more peace than anything he'd seen on her face in the 2 years before his father's death. "I do," she said. "I decided I never want anyone standing outside a door of mine in the dark again. Not me, not anyone." If this story moved you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Daniel was right to confront Marcus publicly at the reception? Or should the confrontation have happened privately first? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're telling the story of a hospice nurse who discovered, during her final weeks caring for a dying stranger, a secret about her own family that no one had ever told her.